Leadership, that is a very rare concept to be seen nowadays during these Brexit days. But having said that, here is a stellar example of leadership shown by these four people right now. When UK got mad and shot itself in the foot with Brexit, these four leaders could have just laid low as the English nationalism took over and threatened with a march with pitchforks and four candles. Judges were branded as enemies of the people by Daily Mail, and Nigel Farage was calling for a people's march to the Supreme Court to put them in place. Fortunately, that didn't materialize at that time. These four leaders stood tall and worked tirelessly behind the scenes to prevent a calamitous cliff edge hard Brexit. They literally risked their lives to an angry mob that could have attacked them, but that didn't scare them. Here is a short story of their wise and brave actions that helped UK to secure the extension of transition period in Brussels. By doing so, they prevented the calamitous cliff edge hard Brexit. As the influence of the hardline Brexiteers got louder and louder, the no-deal Brexit started to loom ever more larger, and the European leaders became really irritated, and they had really had enough, and they were ready to cut out UK membership and take the hit. And that was the circumstances that came about 2 weeks ago, and that alarmed the political heavyweights, previous Prime Minister Mr. Tony Blair, the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, and Mr. Michael Heseltine, and previous Prime Minister John Major. So they got involved at the background, and they started to negotiate with the European Union to influence them, to give some time for Teresa May, so that the reality will kick in as the time goes by. Brexit is not at all good for UK. It is calamitous, in fact, and so very slowly people will begin to realize that as the time goes by. The initial arrogance and hubris will slowly fade away among the Brexiteers, and then common sense will prevail to maintain the European Union membership. So they wrote a political editorial column 2 weeks ago, which appeared in all the newspapers in Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and Netherlands, just before the last meeting between the European Union leaders and Theresa May. And all of a sudden, Theresa May emerged with the possibility of extending the transition of European Union membership if needed. That's what Theresa May needed to maintain peace, and that's what she got. And now the political situation is that most probably the transition period will be extended further.
So we need time, we need much more time.
Not the most promising takeout from a summit that was meant to seal the Brexit deal. The EU's chief negotiator in Brussels on Wednesday, along with all 27 EU members.
Wir wollen gute Beziehungen zu Großbritannien.
All saying the same thing. We want to get a Brexit deal.
That could easily take more than 2 years. And
Now it seems Britain could get a one-year extension to its current transition period. During that time, the UK would keep EU rules and so avoid border problems with Ireland, the current major sticking point. But this sort of extra time is likely to be very unpopular with hardline Brexiteers back home. After talks stalled earlier this week over the issue of the Irish border, Teresa May was determined to stress an accord is still on the cards.
There is still the question of the Northern Irish backstop, but I believe everybody around the table wants to get a deal. And by working intensively and closely, we can achieve that deal. I believe a deal is achievable, and now is the time to make it happen.
I must be clear. Britain wants to remain a good friend and neighbour to Europe. Yet I know there are some voices calling for a punitive deal that punishes Britain and discourages other countries from taking the same path. That would be an act of calamitous self-harm for the countries of Europe, and it would not be the act of a friend. Britain would not, indeed we could not, accept such an approach. And while I am confident that this scenario need never arise, while I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Because we would still be able to trade with Europe, we would still be free to strike trade deals across the world, and we would have the freedom to set the competitive tax rates and embrace the policies that would attract the world's best companies and biggest investors to Britain. And if we were excluded from accessing the single market, we would be free to change the basis of Britain's economic model. But for the EU, it would mean new barriers to trade with one of the biggest economies in the world. It would jeopardise investments in Britain by EU companies worth more than £500 billion. It would mean a loss of access for European firms to the financial services of the City of London. It would risk exports from the EU to Britain worth around £290 billion every year. And it would disrupt the sophisticated and integrated supply chains upon which many EU companies rely. Important sectors of the EU economy would also suffer. We're a crucial, profitable export market for Europe's automotive industry, as well as sectors including energy, food and drink, chemicals, pharmaceuticals and agriculture. These sectors employ millions of people around Europe. And I don't believe that the EU's leaders will seriously tell German exporters, French farmers, Spanish fishermen, the young unemployed of the Eurozone, and millions of others that they want to make them poorer just to punish Britain and make a political point.
So soon after Brexit in 2016, the Anglo-Saxon Teresa May was very arrogant, and in fact, it was sheer hubris, and she threatened Europe with the bad deal, against the bad deal. Then as the time went by, the penny began to slowly drop. May went on a tour to India, Brazil and places like this for trade deal, and every one of them snubbed May in a bad way. Then Mrs. May began to realize that England is not like a British Empire anymore. It is a small island, and it's a small country nowadays. And the European Union leaders are looking at England just like it is a small island next to Europe. So they don't look at England as a very powerful country or very powerful trading nation. The main purpose of European Union was to prevent further wars like First World War or Second World War. Europe had been in war all the time, so European Union's main purpose was preventing peace and preventing wars, and that has been achieved. And unfortunately, England looked EU as a business partner. So that didn't work out. and the expected EU leaders, putting a stop to bad deal did not materialize. In fact, it's only 10% of the European German cars are sold in England, and so the penny slowly dropped, and eventually it finally dropped in Salzburg summit in October. And now we have got the transition deal as a direct result of the four musketeers: Mr. Blair, Mr. John Major, Mr. Heseltine, and Mr. Nick Clegg. Thank God for these wise men. UK had been saved from the calamitous, cliff edge, hard Brexit.